Ethically Speaking is a podcast of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics at the Daniels College of Business.
Hello, I'm Dan Sweeney, the Director of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics at the Daniels College of Business on the University of Denver campus. Welcome to episode 21 of Ethically Speaking, a podcast hosted by the Institute for Enterprise Ethics. Today we're going to talk about ethics and compliance committees of boards of directors. And we have a genuine expert on this topic today. John Holcomb is a professor in the Business Ethics and Legal Studies Department in the Daniels College of Business and an expert on questions of corporate governance. Recently, he published an article on ethics and compliance committees in Corporate Control and Ownership, a leading journal on corporate governance. So let's talk to John. For those listeners who are not very familiar with boards of directors and their structure, what is the usual committee structure of typical Fortune 500 boards? How many committees might there be, and what are the typical committee charges and composition? How do they work?
Well, the top three, and the traditional three, are the audit committee, the nominating committee, which might otherwise be called the governance committee, and the compensation committee. And that is traditional. Every company will have that assortment of committees. And then there are other committees which might be adopted, maybe 2, 3 other committees, including a technology committee, a finance committee, a risk committee, and increasingly public responsibility committees. And then the committees that we'll be discussing today.
Are any of those committees mandated by any law?
The Sarbanes-Oxley law requires that the audit committee have a chief financial expert or a financial expert on the committee. There are more regulations, Dan, and industry standards from the listing standards, NASDAQ and NYSE, on the composition of those committees rather than mandating that there be such a committee. The audit committee probably has the strongest legal standing because the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, passed in 1977, virtually required that companies establish an audit committee in order to track possible off-books accounts that might be used for bribery.
Well, that's helpful, John. Thanks. Let's talk about what these committees do. What are the charges of these 3 or 4 very important committees, and what kind of composition might they have on their membership?
Sure. On the charges, Dan, you can ascertain what they are by they post them now on the websites and explain exactly the function of each committee. Typically, the audit committee, which is the busiest of all the committees, meeting up to 8 or 12 times a year, will be looking at chiefly financial issues. But its domain has also expanded into other sort of regulatory compliance issues as well, but chiefly on finance. The compensation committee, as you might imagine, looks at how the compensation structure is arranged, what criteria are used in order to compensate or judge what the compensation should be, and then they have various regulatory requirements imposed on them as well, such as a compensation discussion and analysis requirement that they have to disclose to the SEC. So there are some regulatory requirements and some that they just voluntarily assume. And then you have the nominating committee, which typically identifies future directors who the company would like to appoint to the board. This may ensue after they have ousted some directors if they're looking for new ones, or they might be, as many companies are now, looking for ways to refresh their boards as against others who are retiring or hitting some age limit.
Do the boards or the chairs of the boards, do they focus on finding people who have deep experience in these areas to assign to those board or those committees?
Yes, and that relates to your question of the composition of those committees. I found some interesting data about the audit committees, which was kind of surprising, but theoretically they're supposed to have, of course, CFOs and people with financial experience in the audit committee. The compensation committee would have both inside directors and outside directors, independent directors, who would have some compensation experience, maybe have served on compensation committees of other boards of directors. And likewise, with the nominating committee, you'd have people who are more experienced with personnel and searches, executive searches, things like that. And I think the seniority of the committees sometimes bespeaks their power. That is, the audit committees generally have been seen to have CEOs, former CEOs. I found in my study, as a matter of fact, that turned out not to be the case, that there were more CEOs and former CEOs on, of all things, the ethics and compliance committees that are now forming, which I think is a positive sign for the power of that new committee. At any rate, I think they try and populate people with the proper, I guess the word would be skills and skill set to be on their particular committee, and with people of requisite independence who might be able to challenge the viewpoints of existing management.
Well, you know, when I was doing my board service, I spent a stint on an audit committee, and the chairman of that audit committee was a former audit partner for one of the big accounting firms. After that experience, I vowed to myself never to sit on an audit committee that didn't have as its chairman a retired audit partner, because these guys have an interrogation style which is really tough to deal with.
Sure.
And I wouldn't want to be on any committee that didn't have one of them running it.
That's right.
So that's good. Let's move on to another topic and talk about the Ethics and Compliance Committee. In your study, you found that only 12 of the top 100 Fortune 500 company boards had a fully functioning Ethics and Compliance Committee. Why such a low percentage?
Historically, most of those functions have been assumed by the audit committee. And I think it's hard in most companies to start something which might be challenging sort of the prevailing system and the way things have been done. However, I think the audit committees, and this is one of my findings in the study, are so busy now that you can almost say they're overburdened. You can also say that some of the current challenges, which go beyond financial compliance issues, really go beyond the skill set of the current members of audit committees. So they find that they want to get in people who have former government experience, maybe on a regulatory agency, people who have a law degree, who are concerned about ways of implementing legal compliance. The other reason that there have been so few of these committees in the past, I think, is because the ethics and compliance function as a staff function has just recently grown up. And so now the question is, are these staff functions going to have access to the board and a reporting relationship to the board? Well, things are so complicated in the lives of audit committees. I think the figuring by some of these companies, the calculation is better to set up a separate committee with people who have a relevant assortment of skills and experiences and who can therefore better understand what ethics and compliance staff people should be doing at the top management level. So I think those are some of the key factors.
I would expect, John, that the existence or the popularity of ethics and compliance committees grew substantially in the mid-2000s following the adventures of Enron and HealthSouth and WorldCom and so on, as boards wanted to find some way to deal with this sort of thing.
Exactly. There are 3 categories within the 12 companies, by the way, and they're all financial companies, which of course is directly related to the 2008 crisis. Some of these companies formed after that point, formed after that point. Energy industry, which has been subject to other crises, and of course 2010 was the year of BP disaster. And then the last one, the pharmaceutical industry, has again 4 companies in that 12. And I think that represents the regulatory pressures and the consumer exposure that particular industry has. All of these have been subject to various public controversies. And so I think the Ethics and Compliance Committees are partially designed to address that issue. I do think that as we look down the road, there will be a growth. And it's only because we can anticipate that there will be more regulatory pressures of different sorts that pop up in reaction to other crises that might occur in the future.
And I suspect that for the same reason, they'll continue to grow because companies will continue to do bad things.
I'm afraid so.
I'm afraid so, too. John, let's get down to the basics. What are the specific responsibilities and functions of a well-run ethics and compliance committee? What do they do?
They're focused more on internal issues. This is a way of distinguishing them, by the way, from the sustainability committees, environmental committees, the public responsibility committees, which tend to look more outward and assess what the external environment is on terms of public policy and maybe stakeholder pressures and things like that. Also, philanthropy. That's always a big issue on the agenda of public responsibility committees. I conceive of the ethics and compliance committees of having a actually more important role of ensuring that the company is abiding by the law, complying with the law, and therefore has a critical function as opposed to maybe just an important function of the Public Responsibility Committee. In terms of the details of that important function, it's going to depend from company to company what exactly are the internal pressures, whether the company has been sued or whether it is involved in a government settlement negotiation, whether it's on a deferred prosecution agreement. There, I think, is where you're going to have a strong input and impact by an ethics and compliance committee, particularly by the 25% of its members that happen to be lawyers. And these are going to be, again, not academic scholars. These are going to be people who have actually been in the trenches and have probably represented white-collar crime cases before or with a prominent white-collar defense firm, and then also have government regulatory experience. You combine that with a profile of them also having been senior-level executives. There are some JDs who haven't gone into just straight legal work or straight government agency work, but have also been, through the revolving door process, senior executives with major companies. Those would be the ideal members of this kind of ethics and compliance committee. In terms of their detailed responsibilities, I think they would also be the repository of reports gathered by the Ethics and Compliance Department, the Ethics and Compliance officers, and particularly of those that are of non-financial importance. And those, of course, are not just accounting fraud, but you got to worry about these days, the Me Too movement, the sexual harassment cases, the HR cases that continually besiege certain corporations. They would be in a monitoring position to make sure that the mechanisms set up are actually working. Too often we have found recently, I think, especially in terms of the epidemic of sexual harassment cases, that those training and remedial programs just haven't worked. So they've got to come up also with developing new systems.
John, is it expected that the chief ethics and compliance officer of a company would have a direct reporting relationship to an ethics and compliance board? Or committee, I should say?
Yes, indeed. I just spoke with one ethics and compliance director of a major company a couple of weeks ago, and she said that she has a quarterly meeting with the Ethics and Compliance Committee of the Board of Directors. So this is, I think, going to be more and more common as time goes on. And you also have to have a system of monitoring complaints, whistleblower complaints and so on from employees. And then also, I think a big role of these committees has to be anticipation. Where are the likely pressures to come from in the future, given our international exposure and exposure of various divisions and product lines? So it's both a monitoring and forward-looking as well as backward-looking kind of role.
Sounds like a pretty important job to get done, and that makes it even more surprising that only 12 of the top 100 Fortune 500 companies have one.
That's right.
A well-functioning one.
Yes, and that's based, Dan, on our reading of the charters. Not just being satisfied with press releases and so on, but trying to figure out exactly what that committee does. Sometimes you can tell that it has a more serious function simply by the length of the charter and how many issues that it addresses. Very frequently, the audit committee, again, will have the longest charter. It will have the greatest frequency of meetings. And then you look, and this is another telling reason why I think they're more important than public responsibility committees. A lot of the charters we looked at there were like a half a page. And they would say, in terms of their meeting schedule, as needed. So some of these committees weren't even meeting more than once a year, if that. But when you got to the ethics and compliance committees, or those committees where we read the charter to convey various important internal responsibilities, the charters were more detailed, the meetings are more frequent. Maybe they don't meet as frequently as some of the audit committees, 8 or 12 times a year, but if you're up to 4 times a year or 6 times a year, that becomes an indicator to us that they are as important as compensation committees and nominating committees.
Sure. Okay, thanks. We recently experienced a major corporate crisis situation when Facebook was found to have allowed the personal data of some 84 million users to be accessed by a UK consulting firm. Is this the kind of crisis, corporate crisis, that a ethics and compliance committee could have helped the company to avoid?
I think it certainly could have. Now that depends on the membership of that committee. Of course, when you mention the UK, it would be very good to have international experts on such a committee who understood the privacy, the value placed on privacy in other countries is perhaps in contrast to our own. But the fact that no one was holding the company accountable, no specific committee on the board, and there weren't any independent outside directors with the proper skill set and instincts and attitude and values on this issue, I think was just a recipe for disaster. So Zuckerberg could go blithely along thinking that his business model was just fine and dandy, and then whenever he was challenged, he could make vague statements about, oh, we'll correct that, or yes, we do have some concerns about privacy, but then no committee on the board holding his feet to the fire or holding him accountable for making those changes within the company. And I think this is repeated in other corporate crises as well.
Well, John, as you and I have talked, Facebook not only had no ethics and compliance committee, they had only an audit committee and a compensation and nominating committee. 2 committees, and both of those committees were headed by the same person. Given that sort of governance structure, was it any surprise to you that Facebook was not only was breached, but that it was a surprise to them and they had no idea what to do?
None at all. It's disappointing. It's disgusting. But it's not a real surprise. In fact, it's a surprise that it didn't happen a lot earlier. I think the composition of the board and the committee that you have referred to indicates that there was no one there who was out of a different mindset, who understood the importance individuals as well as certain key stakeholder groups have placed on privacy, and even more so in the international arena, where it's even a bigger issue in the EU, where Europe, the UK, and so on are now asking Zuckerberg to come before their panels and to testify. He is caught not only unaware, naive, I think is a word that you properly used, but ill-equipped to know how to respond to these from a board level perspective. No good advice there. Having to then to go to outside consultants on how to respond to congressional testimony. And that becomes a crisis in itself. You have to figure out within a few days period what you're going to say on Capitol Hill without tremendously embarrassing yourself and showing tremendous gaps in knowledge. And as a result, there were commentators after his testimony emphasizing the number of times where he said, "We'll get back to you. I'll have to bring it back to my shop." Well, that's reminiscent of the kind of testimony that Tony Hayward from BP gave to U.S. Congress, that I'm not an expert in oil drilling. I have to go back, consult my experts, and then we'll send you in written responses. Zuckerberg, I think, was through his naivete, but also because of his training within a very short period of time, sort of groping for answers and coming up with the best he could provide at that time, which was not satisfactory to many. The other thing to consider is the outside critics that he had on Congress probably didn't have as much of a skill set that they needed either. If there were any real, let's say, technophiles or experts, he could have been roasted even more because they would have called him to task on some of the inadequate answers that he provided.
Well, you know, if you look at Facebook's board composition and their executive group, you find that everybody there, with the possible exception of one, in both the C-suite group and the board, their only business experience has been in Silicon Valley. The only business experience has been in the small business tech operation. They've had no experience operating large, complicated businesses, operating in multiple countries. And a lot of them are VCs, venture capitalists, used to operating private companies, small private companies. So is this an issue that's unique to the tech industry, you think?
It could occur in other industries where startups were prominent, not just technology, but I think technology is the most prominent of all those industries today. I think the lack of having a grown-up in senior management, and I'll tell you, even 20-year-old undergraduate students, when I ask them about Zuckerberg, they will say he's too young. So there's a 20-year-old commenting on a 35-year-old. But obviously, other Silicon Valley companies have gone past the startup stage, maybe not as successful financially as Facebook is at this point, but when you look at the leadership of Apple and Google and Microsoft, you find people who have evolved, let's say, through the naive stage into knowing more what they are doing and have adequate staff and representation, advice on the board level, are engaged in public policy issues, have substantial activities at Google probably being foremost in Washington, D.C. Microsoft learned a lot of lessons, and certainly you'd have to say that Bill Gates is one of the adults in that sector. Harsh to say, perhaps, but I don't think Mark Zuckerberg is right now. He's got a lot of maturing yet to do as a chief executive. Probably has to go beyond, let's say, the sort of external face of the company and making statements about philanthropy and trying to improve the school system of Newark, New Jersey, and to look internally and saying, what should we be as a company? And I think Apple certainly has transcended that stage. Tim Cook being an expert and excellent spokesperson on a lot of these public policy issues that the country cares about. Well, Zuckerberg has to be educated in those areas.
John, you and I chatted earlier before we were joined by our audience here about the dual class structure of shares at Facebook and a number of other newly minted public tech companies, where a limited number of people, typically the founders, have a class of shares where each share has 10 times the voting power of regular shares. This makes Zuckerberg the only significant power in the company and on the board. Does that contribute to this issue of what I consider naivete and hubris?
Most certainly does. And he can dominate the board on most of these decisions. So he has the power. And what is surprising is that most of the experts in corporate governance see this as one of the worst corporate governance practices, dual class ownership. Now, there's a lot of studies out there to try and find out, well, is it correlated with worst financial performance? And, you find some evidence that, in fact, it's mixed. Some of those companies do okay. but it doesn't really help with shareholder empowerment at all. And it's not just Zuckerberg, but it's some of the established companies that have been criticized, like Comcast and like Liberty Media, that have the same structure. And I think if they do not listen to a lot of the critics of that system, they are provoking further public policy pressures and maybe even legislation on this dual class ownership structure, because it is seen as so anathema to good corporate governance practices. And maybe that will be a spillover benefit of the Facebook controversy insofar as other people react the way you do.
Well, I think the fact that he has power over the board totally negates the value of a board to this corporation.
Yep.
And I think if a shareholder, voting share, which is one vote for one share, if that shareholder is upset about this dual class structure, they've got an option. They can sell it.
Yeah, that's right.
And when they bought the shares, they knew what they were buying.
Yeah.
I would hope.
Yeah.
Maybe not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At this point, if the shareholders and the board together are not much of a check on internal management, that's when indirect accountability has to take over, such as the media criticism, the think tanks, the NGOs, associations, citizens rising up, and then Congress taking special measures. It's not clear right now that Congress is going to do much of anything in response to its last congressional session and its last committee review of Zuckerberg. So we shall see, but those who object have to keep pushing and have to keep using the tools of political pressure as they find them, and hope that Zuckerberg pays attention and that he again anticipates further problems and pressures and makes some dramatic changes. We haven't seen any so far.
Well, yeah, that's another thing I wanted to bring up, that he has announced a number of sort of fixes to take care of this data privacy issue. Every one of them that I've read about was either the tweaking of some algorithm or another, or some technical change in the system, the software. He hasn't done anything about this very weak board structure, this very weak committee structure, this very weak governance structure. He either doesn't understand that it can be fixed, or he does understand and he just doesn't want to do it.
No, I think that's right. And in terms of the business model, without any governance accountability, he is not going to be pushed to change what I think is the fundamental characteristic of Facebook, which is you have to opt out in order to escape some of the internal processes that they use. If you required, which no tech company wants required, but if you require your customers to opt in and give permission, that's when the whole thing might fall apart. Because even as accepting as some customers are of invasion of privacy, once you have to take affirmative action to say, okay, I will sacrifice my privacy, you're going to find less willing customers.
And that's exactly what the European Union's new regulations are going to demand. If I were on that board, I'd tell Mr. Zuckerberg, accept the European Union's regulations and implement them throughout the world.
That's the best way to anticipate and respond in order to nip in the bud future pressures which he is simply provoking daily.
Well, you and I ought to write Bark a letter. What do you think, John?
Let's do it.
All right, thanks.
Ethically Speaking is a podcast of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics at the Daniels College of Business. College of Business. College of Business. College of Business.